The chilly October morning of 2019 began with an unusual silence in the suburbs of Minot, North Dakota. 5 unmarked police cars quietly pulled up in front of an old wooden house on 4th Avenue, a place where people usually heard only the wind and the distant sound of trains. Neighbors slightly pulled back their curtains, trying to peek outside as tactical geared officers spread out around the yard, moving slowly as if afraid to shatter the frozen stillness of the morning. Inside the house, a man in his 70s was brewing his familiar cup of coffee, a habit he had kept since his days as a construction worker. A quiet neighbor, everyone thought was just an ordinary working-class American like any other. A sharp knock on the door rang out at 7:18 a.m. "William Harrow, this is the North Dakota Department of Justice. We have a search warrant and request your cooperation regarding an incident that occurred in..." The officers later recounted that his hand trembled slightly as he set the coffee cup down in the sink, but his face remained strangely calm, as if that morning knock was something he had known would eventually come. After more than 60 years of waiting for the shadow of the past to finally knock on the right door. Before we dive deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys in search of forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. The evening of late December 1953, cold wind from the North Dakota plains swept through the low wooden houses of Minot suburbs, carrying the familiar icy scent of winter. In the small house on 4th Avenue, Lucy Mae Halverson, a 9-year-old girl with a petite frame and neatly tied blonde hair, was asked by her mother to take a bag of laundry to the Sunset laundromat just a few blocks away. It was a chore Lucy often did when her mother was busy, and this little neighborhood was so peaceful that no one thought a child walking alone in the evening was anything to worry about. Lucy put on her thick sweater, clutched the laundry bag to her chest to block the wind, and stepped out of the house under the dim yellow light on the porch. The route she took was all too familiar. Cross the gravel-covered front yard, turn right onto the small path leading to the main street, where cars sat covered in a layer of frost on both sides, and sparse streetlights flickered. From there Lucy only needed a few more minutes to reach the laundromat, a small brick building next to a parking lot, its lights glowing through the fogged glass windows. A few locals remembered seeing the figure of a little girl walking quickly, holding the bag with both arms, her head slightly bowed against the wind, but no one paid any extra attention. In a quiet place like Minot, that sight was nothing unusual. Yet when the clock in the house struck 7:45, Lucy's mother began to feel puzzled. It usually took only about 15-20 minutes for Lucy to drop off the laundry and return, but nearly half an hour had already passed. She tried looking out the window, hoping to see Lucy scurrying back through the cold mist, but the dark street was unsettlingly silent. Another 10 minutes went by with no sign. Mrs. Halverson set down the pot she was cooking, threw on a coat and stepped out. The path Lucy usually took was strangely quiet. The streetlights stretched long shadows but revealed no sign of the familiar small figure. She walked faster, calling her daughter's name, the sound carried away by the wind. Near the laundromat she scanned the parking lot, then went inside to ask if anyone had seen Lucy. The attendant on duty shook his head. They hadn't seen any little girl bring laundry that evening. Panic began to tighten as she walked back toward home, searching every yard and dark corner along the sidewalk. Neighbors who heard her calls turned on their lights, came out to ask what was wrong, and joined the search. They split into small groups, flashing lights into places where Lucy might have taken shelter from the wind or taken a wrong turn, but the street seemed to have swallowed every trace. With each passing minute, the unease grew, as if something wrong was lurking in the cold night. When the clock passed 8 and the entire area around the house had been searched with no sign of Lucy, Mrs. Halverson, trembling yet trying to stay calm, stepped back inside, picked up the phone. With no other choice, she called the Minot police and reported that her daughter had disappeared on the way to the laundromat. Immediately after receiving the missing person call from the Halverson family, 2 Minot police patrol officers were dispatched to the 4th Avenue area in less than 10 minutes, beginning the first investigative steps right in the middle of the skin-cutting cold night. They listened as Lucy's mother described the route her daughter took when she left and the expected return time, then quickly determined the last known location on the front porch, where Lucy had hugged the laundry bag and headed toward the Sunset laundromat. The temporary point of disappearance was recorded as the stretch of road between the house and the small alley leading to the main street, since that was the path Lucy had to take to reach the laundromat. The two officers began sweeping the familiar road Lucy always took, from the front steps, through the pitch-dark yard, across the small path to the main road, then along the sidewalk toward the laundromat. They shone their flashlights close to the ground, checking every shadow under trees and every yard along the way, quickly asking the few homes still lit if anyone had seen the girl. A few vaguely recalled seeing a child hurrying through the cold wind, but none could confirm it was Lucy. When the initial efforts yielded no results, police requested additional support and continued searching through the night. Several small teams were formed, one along the main street, another checking around the parking lot near the laundromat, and another heading back toward the house to ensure no turn or dark corner was missed. Flashlights swept across frost-covered walls, old wooden fences, silent backyards, but there was no sign of the girl. The streets of Minot that night were unnaturally quiet. Even the wind whistling through the rooftops became an irritating sound, as every passing minute made the situation more tense. By nearly midnight, as temperatures dropped sharply, the search teams were gradually pulled back for safety. A quick report was filed on scene, no clear traces, no one confirmed seeing Lucy near the time of disappearance, no items left behind along the route. The next morning, as weak early daylight filtered through gray clouds, the search expanded dramatically. More officers were called in. A temporary command post was set up near the laundromat, and the search radius was widened, checking the entire route from the laundromat to neighboring residential areas, extending to the parking lot behind it, and stretching along the banks of the Mouse River, an isolated area, full of bushes and easy-to-hide traces. Teams continued combing every meter of ground, every thick bush, every back porch. While sweeping areas of soft earth still bearing marks from slowly melting snow, a few officers noted disturbed patches and faint drag marks, as if something had been pulled across. Though not yet forensically confirmed, these traces were immediately flagged for further examination. Another search line also discovered several unclear shoe prints on hardened ground marks, not sharp enough to identify, but enough to make investigators realize something unusual had happened in the area. Lucy passed through. Lucy's disappearance was no longer just a case of a child getting lost in the cold night. The first tentative signs suggested possible outside intervention, and the Minot investigation officially entered a more intense phase. The morning search was still underway intensely, when an officer at the edge of the parking lot next to Sunset Laundromat spotted an object lying off to the side on the damp, cold ground. The box of laundry detergent the family confirmed Lucy always carried when doing laundry. The box was covered in dew, its bottom scratched, clearly showing signs of being dropped or dragged, and its appearance there immediately caused the area to be cordoned off as a high suspicion point. Everyone present understood this could be the first major milestone in tracing Lucy's path. Flashlights were shone close to the ground for inspection. On the hard surface mixed with patches of dried mud from lingering melted snow, a faint drag mark appeared, leading deeper into the parking lot, not clearly sourced, but enough to show something had been moved by pulling force rather than a child's small footstep. Interspersed among these marks were several messy shoe prints, much larger than a child's shoes, along with a short, shallow tire tread at the lot's edge. All these details weren't clear enough to conclude anything definitive but were too unusual to ignore. To clarify activity around the area on the night Lucy disappeared, police went door to door near the parking lot for further questioning. Most residents only recalled vague sounds of passing vehicles, but couldn't be certain of timing or type. Only one statement stood out amid the vagueness: 12-year-old Alice Morgan, who lived across from the parking lot. Alice said that the previous evening, while standing on her porch waiting for her mother to lock the back door, she saw a dark green pickup truck driving very slowly along the main road. The truck only had its dim yellow lights on, so faint that Alice had to squint to make out the paint color. What impressed her most wasn't the truck itself, but the man behind the wheel. Dark hair, slightly thin build, but with very stiff shoulder movements, as if he was carefully watching something outside. The truck turned into the parking lot, lingered for a moment, then disappeared down the small road behind the laundromat. Alice's statement perfectly matched the location where the detergent box was found, and was also consistent with the marks on the ground. No other witness provided more detailed information, so the girl's description immediately became the most vulnerable lead at that point. From the evidence gathered that morning, the detergent box, drag marks, shoe prints, tire tread, and the description of the green pickup and the man driving it, police formed their first suspect profile. A man driving a small dark green pickup truck, who appeared at the exact place and time Lucy vanished. This investigative direction opened a decisive new branch, pushing the case beyond a simple missing child and deeper into the possibility of outside abduction. The clues gathered around the parking lot pushed police to widen the search into more remote areas, especially toward the stretch of woods along the Mouse River, a wild strip of land thick with brush, low pines and uneven ground where winter sunlight reached only a few hours a day. The area was rarely traveled, and that very isolation made it a top priority search direction. Search teams began sweeping in narrow lines, pushing deeper into the brush and the soft patches of earth, still holding traces of the night's melting snow. When a team of 3 officers followed a trail right along the riverbank, they stopped at a long scraped stretch of ground, as if the earth had been gouged by something heavy being dragged. The mark was uneven, shallow in places, deeper in others, running diagonally from the edge of the trail into the dense trees. These marks didn't match the drag marks at the parking lot exactly, but the direction and shape were similar enough to grab the officers' full attention. They followed the trail with flashlights, moving carefully so as not to disturb the evidence. The deeper they went into the brush, the heavier the air felt. It was so quiet they could hear snowmelt dripping from the branch. Then in a patch of woods a few dozen yards from the river, one of the officers froze. His flashlight had just swept across a small motionless shape, lying among the dry leaves. One glance was all it took. They had found Lucy. Lucy's body lay on its side, one arm hidden under leaves. Her thick green coat was caked with dirt and large patches of red clay. Her skin was deathly pale in the biting cold, making the scene even more heartbreaking. The cotton dress she had worn that day was filthy and crumpled. One detail immediately caught the officer's eyes. Lucy's beloved purple shoes, the ones she always wore, were completely gone. Only her socks remained, pulled askew and caked with mud. The forensics team was called in as soon as the area was secure. Officers set up a temporary cordon and marked every spot that might hold evidence. Every centimeter around the body was examined. The ground mixed with dry leaves showed adult shoe prints running in different directions. Some soft patches nearby had wide indentations that could match the drag marks. Near a tree trunk, very faint tire tracks suggested a vehicle had stopped and then left. The marks weren't sharp, but they were clear enough to prove that Lucy hadn't been alone here. Someone else had brought her to this spot and moved her body. Forensic specialists knelt beside Lucy's body for the initial examination. Her clothing was photographed from every angle, documenting its condition and the distribution of dirt. 2 distinct types of soil clung to the fabric, a thin layer of gray-brown dirt, and large obvious patches of brick-red clay. An odd detail since the area where the body was found had only dark soil, no red clay like that found much farther away. When the body was placed in a preservation bag and taken to the central Minot morgue, the autopsy began that same afternoon. The medical examiner started by establishing time of death based on body temperature, rigor mortis, and early signs of decomposition. Preliminary findings showed Lucy had died only a few hours after disappearing, and crucially, there were no signs she had died in the riverside woods. It was far more likely she had been brought there after death. Further examination of her clothing and body revealed more critical detail. Bruising appeared around her shoulders and arms, possibly from being dragged or held tightly. Thick patches of red clay on the lower part of her dress, completely inconsistent with the geology of the discovery site, raised major questions about where she had been taken before being dumped. While examining the coat, the medical examiner used tweezers to lift a dark hair caught in the hood. The strand was much longer than Lucy's hair and had a completely different texture. It was impossible to say yet whether it belonged to a man or woman, but its length and thickness suggested an adult. The hair was sealed in a separate evidence bag. Back then it was one of the most valuable clues police had. The preliminary cause of death came after examining the neck and soft tissues. Lucy had been strangled with enough force to damage deep tissue. To the naked eye, the marks suggested a hand or soft object, rather than something hard. There was no evidence she was still alive when dragged into the woods, further supporting the theory that the body had been moved after the killer was finished. When the autopsy report reached headquarters that night, investigators understood they were dealing not just with a missing child, but with a deliberate murder. The evidence collected, the strange hair, 2 types of soil, shoe prints, Tire tracks and drag marks became the foundation for the next phase, where even the smallest clue could lead to the killer. The autopsy results were rushed to the Minot Police Department's analysis lab, where detectives and forensic technicians began processing every sample collected from the riverside scene. The focus now was not only confirming cause of death, but decoding the route the killer had taken with Lucy before dumping her body by the river. Every piece of evidence, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, was treated as a key to the truth. The unknown hair found in Lucy's hood was the first item under the microscope. Under magnification, technicians noted it was thick, dark brown and strong, characteristics of an adult, most likely male. In 1953, DNA analysis didn't exist, but the physical properties were still enough for future comparison with suspects. The hair was stored separately in a sterile container and marked high value, one of the few traces that could directly point to someone who had been in close contact with Lucy. Next, the team examined the two types of soil on her coat and dress. At the riverside scene, the ground was mostly gray-brown clay mixed with sand, typical of the Mouse River area. Yet the heavy red clay patches on the lower dress did not match at all. Technicians quickly took samples, dried them, and sent them to the county geologist for mineral analysis. The results got everyone's attention, but the denser red clay belonged to a type found near the Garrison Dam construction site, more than 20 miles southwest of Minot. And beneath some of the red clay, traces of bentonite clay appeared, a type mined only near Dickinson, even farther west. This meant Lucy's body had come into contact with at least two completely different geological zones, neither of which was close to where she was found. Lucy's disappearance was no longer a crime of opportunity or a spur-of-the-moment act. The killer had taken her a considerable distance, possibly in a vehicle, before returning toward the river to dispose of the body. Understanding that geographic journey became the next critical task. Technicians then turned to the tire and shoe impressions collected from both the parking lot and the riverside woods. Though wind and light snow had blurred most of the tire tracks, what remained was enough to identify the tread pattern, a common design on early 1950s light trucks. A significant match with witness Alice Morgan's description of a dark green pickup. The shoe prints in the soft dirt by the river were adult male size, with thick, fairly flat soles typical of work boots worn by manual laborers, tradesmen, or long-haul drivers. Putting it all together, adult hair, Garrison Dam clay, bentonite traces, male shoe prints, light truck tire marks, and the witness statement about a dark green pickup. The investigators realized the killer was unlikely to be a random passer-through. He was far more likely someone whose job required travel between regions. Dam construction workers, clay miners, transport workers, material haulers, or independent contractors with their own trucks. Using the clay evidence, the team mapped the most probable route, a path connecting Minot to Garrison, looping toward Dickinson, or similar geological areas, then back to the river. This was not a road a stranger would know well, only someone familiar with the back roads, someone who traveled them regularly for work. The analysis allowed investigators to narrow suspects to three main groups: miners or bentonite workers around Dickinson, transport drivers or freelance laborers regularly traveling between job sites. Of these, Garrison Dam workers became the primary focus. The distinctive red clay from that site was heavily present on Lucy's clothing, and in 1953 the dam was one of North Dakota's biggest projects, drawing hundreds of transient workers, many from out of state with no permanent records in Minot. Minot police began compiling lists of men in those occupations, especially those known to own or drive dark green pickups, matching the witness description. The investigation shifted from residential neighborhoods to work camps and material transport. The pool of potential suspects was now much clearer, setting the stage for the deeper inquiries to come. The geological evidence combined with tire tread details pushed police to focus heavily on individuals who owned or regularly drove light trucks in the Minot area and beyond, especially dark green early 1950s pickups, matching Alice Morgan's description. Tracing the vehicle became the next priority. If they could pinpoint the exact truck, the odds of finding the killer would skyrocket. Minot police worked with the Ward County Vehicle Registry to pull records of every green light truck registered between. Though records were mostly handwritten and basic, investigators still managed to identify nearly 24 possible owners, plumbers, construction workers, haulers, even a few farmers on the outskirts of town. From that list they built short profiles: age, residence, work schedule, physical description, and most importantly, where each man claimed to be the evening Lucy vanished. Teams fanned out to interview every owner, check alibis, and pay special attention to anyone who regularly traveled the Minot Garrison Dickinson routes that matched the Clay evidence. More than half the list was cleared fairly quickly. Solid alibis, like confirmed night shifts or trucks that had been broken down and immobile. But one name started standing out: Jimmy Rourke, 28. A contract air compressor mechanic who lived in a cheap boarding house near the South Side rail tracks. Rourke owned a 1951 dark green Ford F1, the exact make and color described by the witness. When police visited his residence, several red flags appeared immediately. First, Rourke had a large, freshly bandaged wound on his left palm. He claimed he'd slipped while working on a machine 2 days earlier, but a neighbor had seen him the night Lucy disappeared with no bandage. His hand had been fine. Second, when asked to account for his movements that evening, his story kept changing. At first he said he'd stayed home all night. Then he claimed he'd gone to buy drinks at a store near the train depot. The store clerk confirmed Rourke had not been there that night. The shifting story made him an instant person of interest. Officers did a visual inspection of Rourke's pick. Without a full search warrant, they couldn't dismantle anything or take interior samples, but even from the outside they noted suspicious details. Mud under the chassis that looked like Garrison Dam clay, tires with the same tread pattern as the faint tracks by the river, and long, fresh scratches along the bed as if the truck had pushed through heavy brush. When asked about the mud and scratches, Rourke said he'd driven to a job site about 25 miles out a few days earlier, but when pressed for the site name, exact dates, or co-workers, he couldn't provide any specific. These inconsistencies led investigators to compare everything they had against Rourke. The faint riverside tire tracks were consistent in size with a Ford F1. The shoe prints at the scene closely matched the size and flat work boot sole Rourke wore. His travel patterns fit the route that produced both types of clay. The hand injury was consistent with someone who might have been scratched dragging a body through thick brush. Yet when it came to hard legal evidence, the biggest problem emerged. Nothing directly tied Rourke to Lucy. No fibers, no fingerprints, none of her belongings in his truck or on his person. The hair found on Lucy's coat could have been a game changer if it matched Rourke's, but 1953 technology only allowed microscopic comparison of structure and color, and the results were not conclusive enough to charge. Additionally, Rourke had no prior record, no history of violence, and co-workers described him as rough around the edges, but not a troublemaker. That made pushing the case forward difficult. The law required strong evidence, and what they had so far only amounted to coincidences, odd behavior, compatible traces, and contradictory statements, none of it direct enough for a murder charge. The team kept pressing Rourke in interrogation, but he stayed half cooperative, half guarded, never clearly denying or confirming anything. Every answer showed irritation, but nothing illegal that would let police hold him longer. After hours of questioning and comparison, police had to admit that although Jimmy Rourke was by far the strongest suspect they had, the legal evidence simply wasn't there yet to arrest him. They had suspicious coincidences, strange behavior, matching traces, and lies, but nothing that would hold up as direct proof in a case this serious. Rourke remained under quiet surveillance, his file flagged red for continued monitoring, but the investigation could not hinge on one man alone, especially when the physical evidence hadn't yet delivered a definitive answer. The limits of 1953 forensic technology forced police to broaden the search again, hoping for clearer leads that could finally break through the growing deadlock in the Lucy May Halverson case. The geological evidence combined with tire tread details pushed police to focus heavily on individuals who owned or regularly drove light trucks in the Minot area and beyond, especially dark green early 1950s pickups, matching Alice Morgan's description. Tracing the vehicle became the next priority. If they could pinpoint the exact truck, the odds of finding the killer would skyrocket. Minot police worked with the Ward County Vehicle Registry to pull records of every green light truck registered between Though records were mostly handwritten and basic, investigators still managed to identify nearly 24 possible owners, plumbers, construction workers, haulers, even a few farmers on the outskirts of town. From that list they built short profiles: age, residence, work schedule, physical description, and most importantly, where each man claimed to be the evening Lucy vanished. Teams fanned out to interview every owner, check alibis, and pay special attention to anyone who regularly traveled the Minot Garrison Dickinson routes that matched the clay evidence. More than half the list was cleared fairly quickly, solid alibis like confirmed night shifts or trucks that had been broken down and immobile. But one name started standing out: Jimmy Rourke, 28, a contract air compressor mechanic, who lived in a cheap boarding house near the South Side rail tracks. Rourke owned a 1951 dark green Ford F1, the exact make and color described by the witness. When police visited his residence, several red flags appeared immediately. First, Rourke had a large, freshly bandaged wound on his left palm. He claimed he'd slipped while working on a machine 2 days earlier, but a neighbor had seen him the night Lucy disappeared with no bandage. His hand had been fine. Second, when asked to account for his movements that evening, his story kept changing. At first he said he'd stayed home all night. Then he claimed he'd gone to buy drinks at a store near the train depot. The store clerk confirmed Rourke had not been there that night. The shifting story made him an instant person of interest. Officers did a visual inspection of Rourke's pickup. Without a full search warrant, they couldn't dismantle anything or take interior samples, but even from the outside they noted suspicious details: mud under the chassis that looked like Garrison Dam clay, tires with the same tread pattern as the faint tracks by the river, and long, fresh scratches along the bed, as if the truck had pushed through heavy brush. When asked about the mud and scratches, Rourke said he'd driven to a job site about 25 miles out a few days earlier, but when pressed for the site name, exact dates, or co-workers, he couldn't provide any specific. These inconsistencies led investigators to compare everything they had against Rourke. The faint riverside tire tracks were consistent in size with a Ford F1. The shoe prints at the scene closely matched the size and flat work boot sole Rourke wore. His travel patterns fit the route that produced both types of clay. The hand injury was consistent with someone who might have been scratched dragging a body through thick brush. Yet when it came to hard legal evidence, the biggest problem emerged. Nothing directly tied Rourke to Lucy. No fibers, no fingerprints, none of her belongings in his truck or on his person. The hair found on Lucy's coat could have been a game changer if it matched Rourke's, but 1953 technology only allowed microscopic comparison of structure and color, and the results were not conclusive enough to charge. Additionally, Rourke had no prior record, no history of violence, and co-workers described him as rough around the edges, but not a troublemaker. That made pushing the case forward difficult. The law required strong evidence, and what they had so far only amounted to coincidences, odd behavior, compatible traces, and contradictory statements, none of it direct enough for a murder charge. The team kept pressing Rourke in interrogation, but he stayed half cooperative, half guarded, never clearly denying or confirming anything. Every answer showed irritation but nothing illegal that would let police hold him long. After hours of questioning and comparison, police had to admit that although Jimmy Rourke was by far the strongest suspect they had, the legal evidence simply wasn't there yet to arrest. They had suspicious coincidences, strange behavior, matching traces, and lies, but nothing that would hold up as direct proof in a case this serious. Rourke remained under quiet surveillance, his file flagged red for continued monitoring. But the investigation could not hinge on one man alone, especially when the physical evidence hadn't yet delivered a definitive answer. The limits of 1953 forensic technology forced police to broaden the search again, hoping for clearer leads that could finally break through the growing deadlock in the Lucy May Halverson case. The check on Jimmy Rourke did not yield the breakthrough investigators had hoped for, forcing the police to widen the scope beyond the pickup truck owners and turn toward occupational groups that could have come into contact with the specific clays found on Lucy's clothing. The first focus was the Garrison Dam construction site, where hundreds of workers from multiple states had poured in during the building years. These men regularly traveled between Minot and the dam, drove pickups, and wore work boots very similar to the prints left in the riverside wood. Police compiled a list of every worker present at Garrison Dam during the roughly 1-week window surrounding Lucy's disappearance. The list was longer than expected. Most were project-based hires living in temporary camps, with no fixed address. Many claimed they had worked straight through the evening in question, but verification was nearly impossible, since not every shift had supervised time logs, especially during peak construction periods. Some were cooperative, others grew irritated at the question. Yet even the most suspicious ones left no physical evidence directly tying them to Lucy. After Garrison Dam, the team shifted to the bentonite clay mines near Dickinson, the only place in the region that produced the exact mineral match found on Lucy's dress. The worker list there was even harder to control. Most were seasonal laborers who moved constantly between states. Police interviewed those on duty around the time Lucy vanished, checked clay shipment schedules, and looked for anyone who owned a green pickup or who had left the mine on the exact day she disappeared. A few were noted as driving pickups, but the colors didn't match, or their travel timelines conflicted with the crime window. No one in this group exhibited behavior or evidence strong enough to pursue further. The next line of inquiry targeted military personnel from Minot Air Force Base, a group that regularly came into town on leave and often owned personal vehicles. Police drew up a list of servicemen who owned early 1950s pickups and interviewed them about their whereabouts, duty hours, and any base exits near the time of the crime. Most had solid alibis thanks to the military's gate logs, making it far less likely that an airman could have taken Lucy from a residential area all the way to the Riverside woods. A handful couldn't recall their exact schedules, but none showed matches to the scene or forensic sample. Leaving no stone unturned, detectives then broadened the net to long-haul truck drivers, men who traveled between cities and often passed through Minot at night. They had large rigs, long routes, and could stop anywhere without drawing notice. Yet when freight logs and fuel stop records were cross-checked, no driver was in Minot at the precise time Lucy vanished, and then left immediately afterward toward the areas with the distinctive clay. The most suspicious ones had their boots examined, but the tread patterns and sizes did not match the prints at the scene. To strengthen the legal foundation, forensic technicians continued comparing every sample against the expanded suspect pools. Tire tracks were only generally consistent with many pickups of the same era, keeping vehicle narrowing at a standstill. Boot prints never perfectly matched anyone checked, only reaching the level of similarity. The distinctive clays from Garrison and Dickinson overlapped with too many occupational groups, leaving the suspect pool far too broad. Meanwhile, townspeople provided no new witness information. Alice Morgan remained the only person who saw the pickup, and though her description was valuable, it still lacked detail sufficient for identification. The parking lot where the detergent box was found was searched one final time. No fabric scraps, objects, or fingerprints remained. Police also found no additional drag marks or alternate trails in the Riverside woods, beyond the one that led to Lucy's body. Every avenue opened circled back to the same starting point. The perpetrator was most likely a man familiar with the terrain, who owned a truck, regularly moved through the network of construction sites, yet left no legal trace the police could follow. The inconsistency among the traces, the lack of forensic technology available at the time, and the sheer size of the potential suspect groups, made the case increasingly murky. Gradually, tension enveloped the entire Minot Police Department investigation room. Files grew thicker, suspect lists lengthened, but truly valuable evidence never appeared. Detectives began to accept that despite exhausting every possible direction from dam workers, miners, long-haul drivers, to military personnel, no one matched the evidence strongly enough to conclude anything. And with every effort at checking, verifying, and comparing leading only to dead ends, the investigation into Lucy May Halverson began to stall, slowly sliding into the impasse no one wanted to see. The following weeks passed in exhaustion and heaviness for the entire investigative team, and although they had expanded every possible lead to the limit, the Minot police had to face the reality that nothing had produced results strong enough to move forward. When interviews yielded nothing more, when the suspect list kept growing, yet no one on it had direct evidence tying them to Lucy, and when the forensic traces only reached a level of compatibility rather than specific identification, the team realized they had hit the ceiling of what could be done. An internal meeting was held at Minot Police headquarters to compile every piece of data collected in the 2 months since Lucy's disappearance. All reports from the parking lot scene, the Riverside woods, witness statements, information from Garrison dam workers, bentonite miners, long-haul drivers, and military personnel records were stacked into individual files in the meeting room. Crime scene photographs, faint tire impressions, drag marks, notes on the two clay types, even sketches of the suspected killer's route were recategorized. This compilation was not meant to open new leads, but to ensure every detail was accurately recorded before the case had to be shelved for lack of progress. When the initial investigation report was finalized, the legal team reviewed prosecution criteria under the current circumstance. Though numerous points of suspicion and several notable coincidences existed, like the case of Jimmy Rourke, everything remained unproven hypothesis. There were no fingerprints, no evidence in any suspect's vehicle or home, no direct witness who saw Lucy with anyone, and especially, no DNA technology to test the unknown hair. Prosecuting without convincing legal evidence would never survive court and could even ruin future chances of catching the killer. In that context, the Minot police had no choice but to decline to charge anyone. The decision weighed heavily on everyone involved, because everyone understood that a case involving a 9-year-old child was never easy to close with insufficient evidence. Immediately after the conclusion was finalized, all physical evidence in the Lucy May Halverson case was sealed according to the preservation standards of the era. Lucy's clothing, the detergent box, soil samples, the hair, tire and boot photos, riverside fabric scraps and scene notes. Everything was placed in separate storage boxes, numbered, and moved to long-term storage in Ward County. In that warehouse, among dozens of other unsolved cases, Lucy's box was set on a cold metal shelf, marked with the date and investigative status. The Minot Police Department officially reclassified the case as a cold case, a term for files with no progress, insufficient evidence, and awaiting future leads. For a small town like Minot, this was rare and left a lingering unease in the community. But given the limitations of the time, it was the only option. Time moved on, the town changed, the road Lucy once walked was repaved, the parking lot beside Sunset Laundromat changed owners multiple times, and new trails grew in the riverside wood. Yet in the quiet storage warehouse, the brown evidence box labeled Lucy May Halverson. The case of the 9-year-old girl dragged from a familiar street and left beside the river had been frozen for decades, becoming a silent grief for her family, an unsolved mystery, and one of the longest-running cold cases in Minot's history. More than 6 decades after Lucy May Halverson's file was placed on a cold shelf in storage, the case had almost vanished from the memory of Minot's newer generation. But in 2019, when the state of North Dakota launched its cold case review program, statewide project to re-examine unsolved cases from the previous century, Lucy's name suddenly reappeared on the priority list. Cases involving children are always moved to the top, and program forensic experts quickly realized that Lucy's 1953 file had a rare feature. The primary physical evidence was still preserved intact. This offered an opportunity that had been impossible at the time of the crime. When the evidence box was transferred from storage to the Modern Analysis Lab at the North Dakota Crime Laboratory, technicians broke the seals under camera supervision, following strict chain-of-custody protocol to avoid damaging the already aged item. Layer after layer of yellowed wrapping paper and old-generation PVC evidence bags were opened, revealing Lucy's tiny clothes, soil patches hardened over time, fabric scraps from the riverside scene, photographs of tire tracks, and most important, the unknown hair carefully clipped between 2 glass slides since 19. For soil, tire impressions, or fabric, their value now was mainly referential. Soil cannot yield DNA, and the tire prints were too old to match any modern tire. But the team wasn't counting on them. Instead, they focused on the 2 items with far greater potential: Lucy's clothing and the hair belonging to the unidentified man. Lucy's clothes, her green coat, cotton dress, and remaining socks, were taken to the biology section to test for any surviving skin cells, sweat or other biological traces that might have lasted 66. Technicians used blue light, UV and modern microscopes to search for remnants. The fabric surfaces had worn over time, but some high-contact areas still retained enough fiber structure for testing. Yet the clothing was not what made the team hold its breath. It was the single long dark brown hair the 1953 medical examiner had plucked from Lucy's coat hood. When the glass slide holding the hair was placed on the table under modern white light, the forensic experts saw that, despite 66 years, the hair shaft was relatively intact. It had not crumbled, had not rotted, and most crucially, the root, though not perfect, appeared to retain some cellular structure, capable of containing nuclear DNA. The biggest question: was this hair sufficient for modern DNA extraction? The team ran a series of non-destructive tests to determine feasibility. Initial results showed the keratin structure had not fully degraded, and contamination levels were low, thanks to decades of proper storage. This surprised the experts. Few 1950s samples retain enough quality for DNA testing. In the modern forensic feasibility meeting, each specialist presented their findings. Hair structure still sound, nuclear DNA extraction feasible. If nuclear DNA is insufficient, minty DNA, mitochondrial DNA analysis, more durable, remains an option. Clothing may yield additional support if any skin cells remain. Based on these factors, discussion shifted to the potential not only of obtaining DNA, but of running it through modern databases, starting with CODIS. And if no match was found there, newer techniques like forensic genealogy DNA could become the final tool, the method that had already cracked numerous cold cases across America. The atmosphere in the meeting room was heavy yet hopeful. Many on the cold case review team were used to disappointment when opening decades-old files only to find evidence rotted or worthless. But Lucy's case was different. Here they had a hair, the one thing the killer had accidentally left behind, and it was still intact enough to become the decisive clue. Finally, after much discussion, the cold case review program supervisor concluded, the hair will be sent for full modern DNA analysis. That decision was recorded in the minutes, and the 1953 hair, evidence forgotten for over 60 years, was placed in a new modern evidence box, sealed to current standards, ready to restart the Lucy May Halverson investigation with technology that did not exist the day she vanished. The unanimous decision from the cold case review meeting gave the forensic team the green light to move immediately to the most critical step: extracting DNA from a hair that had survived. The strand was transferred to the North Dakota State Crime Lab, where technicians prepared a highly delicate sequence of procedures to avoid damaging a sample that was literally irreplaceable. The process began by carefully removing the hair from its old glass slide and placing it on a sterile surface under a microscope. Seeing that only a tiny root segment remained, the technicians opted for an enzyme-based DNA release method specifically designed to recover nuclear DNA from extremely old or degraded samples. A separate section of the hair shaft was also taken for mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA analysis, the more resilient type that often survives for decades under good storage conditions. After nearly 48 hours of incubating the extraction solution, the lab received the first signal. A small amount of nuclear DNA had been liberated, not much, but enough to run multiple cycles of PCR amplification. The technicians immediately began replicating the DNA fragments, monitoring each cycle closely to prevent contamination. Once the samples reached readable levels, the analysis team generated a genetic profile, and after cross-checking multiple runs, produced the official DNA profile of the suspect, an achievement the Minot police in 19. The next step was decisive: uploading that profile to CODIS, the largest national criminal DNA database in the United States. If the killer had ever been arrested or had his DNA collected in any serious case, a match would appear instantly. But when the screen displayed no match found, silence filled the room. Nothing in CODIS matched the hair's DNA. No prior convictions, no latent prints, no flagged individuals. The conclusion was clear: the perpetrator had never been arrested, never had his DNA taken, and did not exist in any modern criminal database. Although the result did not immediately yield the killer's name, it revealed something else of vital importance. The perpetrator belonged to the group of people who had stayed completely outside the justice system, making the case even more unpredictable and requiring entirely new investigative approaches. Unable to rely on CODIS, the team turned to the most powerful tool in modern forensics: genetic genealogy, the method that had cracked dozens of cold cases over the past decade, most famously the Golden State Killer. Genetic genealogy works by comparing the suspect's DNA against millions of user-submitted profiles on public genealogy sites like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. It does not identify the perpetrator directly, but it can locate distant relatives, rebuild family trees, narrow the pool to a small group of possible individuals, and ultimately pinpoint the subject. To start the process, the forensic team had to convert the DNA profile into a format compatible with genealogy platforms. Technicians standardized the data, removed duplicates, corrected genetic markers, and ensured the Lucy 1953 suspect file met the standards required by public databases. When the work was complete, the DNA profile sat in an encrypted folder, ready for upload, but before taking that step, the investigators had to clear a legal review to ensure full compliance with privacy regulations. Even for a 66-year-old case, using DNA to search for relatives still required permits and formal approval. The final meeting of the month ended with a historic decision for the Lucy May Halverson investigation. Proceed with uploading the suspect's DNA profile to GEDmatch and other public genealogy databases. The nameless hair, once regarded as nothing more than minor evidence in a 1953 paper file, had become the key to a new investigative door. Within days, the DNA of the man who had contact with Lucy on that frigid night would enter one of the world's largest genealogical networks, and from that moment, the journey to uncover his true identity officially began. Uploading the suspect's DNA profile to GEDmatch launched an entirely new phase of the investigation, and within days the system began returning distant relative matches, not parents, siblings, or close cousins, but third, fourth, and even fifth cousins. In forensic genealogy, these were the first pieces needed to construct a vast family tree network that could lead to the man behind the hair in Lucy's clothing. The initial matches were scattered across the United States, Minnesota, Nebraska, a few in Montana. But when the analysts mapped relative density by region, one cluster stood out. Several matches with similar shared DNA segments traced their ancestry to North Dakota, specifically the Minot Ward County area in the early 20s. This suggested the killer was not a transient, but possibly someone born into a family long established in the region. The genealogy team began building the tree, using each DNA match to work backward to common ancestors. The task required combining genetic data with public records, old census reports, church registries, birth and marriage certificates, and population lists from the early. From what first appeared to be disconnected names, they gradually linked branches into a structure that traced back to two large families present in Minot. When data from different branches was merged, a pattern emerged. Most DNA-related individuals descended from two ancestral couples living in Ward County around. From those two root families, the team built a multi-generational tree connecting more than 50 people who shared distant DNA with the suspect. To narrow the field, the genealogists focused only on individuals old enough to have committed the crime in 19. This quickly eliminated younger descendants, leaving just over a dozen men born between 19. For deeper filtering, investigators examined occupation, residence, and presence near Minot for each man. When cross-referenced with the distinctive clay traces found on Lucy's clothing, the list shrank dramatically. Some had never left their hometowns, others worked in factories unrelated to clay or construction sites, and some did not own vehicles matching the green pickup description. After eliminating mismatches, the circle of suspicion closed around just 3 men whose backgrounds, travel patterns, and timelines aligned with the case. William Bill Harrow, the name that stood out most prominently. When Harrow's file was opened, details immediately caught the attention of both the genealogy team and investigators. Born in the early 1920s in Minot, raised in the Ward County area, he later worked jobs involving hauling equipment and construction materials. During the 1950s, records placed him repeatedly in geological zones that matched the clay on Lucy's clothes, specifically the Garrison Dam and the bentonite-rich areas around Dickinson. Moreover, old vehicle records showed Harrow owned a dark green 1951 pickup, an uncanny match for Alice Morgan's description the night Lucy vanished. Although the license plate was no longer on file, the identical make, model, and color elevated him for closer scrutiny. When the genealogy team compared DNA shared between Harrow and distant relatives on the platforms, the percentages aligned with the pattern expected for the primary subject of the tree. Although Harrow's own DNA was not directly available, it could be confidently inferred through the combination of relatives' contributions. At this stage, no final conclusion could be drawn, yet William Bill Harrow emerged unmistakably at the top of the suspect list, not because of any criminal record, he had virtually none, but because of the convergence of genetic markers, geological routes, vehicle information, and his documented presence in key locations during the period Lucy disappeared. The family tree was no longer just a map of relatives, it had become a map that tightened the noose, bringing the investigation one crucial step closer to the true identity of the man who left that hair in Lucy May Halverson's clothing on a freezing night. The genealogical data elevating William Bill Harrow to the primary suspect prompted the investigation team to redirect all resources toward verifying his demographic background, residential history and employment records from the early. Within days of searching archived records from Ward County, the city of Minot, and the Garrison Dam project, a picture of Harrow's life emerged with startling almost eerie coincidence. Employment records from the Garrison Dam showed Harrow worked there intermittently from the late 1940s through the mid-1950s, performing heavy labor, hauling materials, operating compressors, and assisting construction crews. Those jobs required constant travel across the massive project site, renowned for its distinctive red clay, the same clay found caked on Lucy's dress. Timesheets also confirmed Harrow was on site during the fall of 1953, very close to the date of Lucy's murder. What drew even sharper attention was the work assignment log. Harrow was part of a crew that regularly transported equipment from Garrison Dam to repair shops in Dickinson, the only area in the state with bentonite clay matching the second soil sample on Lucy's clothes. An ordinary person would rarely have reason to be in both Garrison and Dickinson within a short period, but for Harrow it was part of his weekly route. Residential records confirmed Harrow lived at 3 different addresses around Minot between 1951 and 1954, 2 of which were near the main road connecting the town to the parking area beside Sunset Laundromat, where Lucy's box of detergent was recovered. That placement explained how a green pickup could appear in the area on the night of the crime without raising suspicion. If Harrow was local, his truck would have been a familiar sight. Vehicle registration records from Ward County added another critical piece. Harrow owned a dark green 1951 Ford F1, a perfect match for witness Alice Morgan's description. Though the old plates had been destroyed, confirmation of color and year was enough to raise the coincidence to a significant level. Furthermore, the truck was registered as a construction vehicle, which explained why it could carry multiple types of soil, a detail noted on the suspect vehicle examined back in. To pinpoint Harrow's whereabouts on the exact night Lucy vanished, investigators searched shift logs, time cards, medical records, and internal Garrison Dam reports for any indication of presence or absence. Though incomplete, the surviving documents confirmed Harrow did not clock in that evening. One former co-worker, interviewed years earlier, had recalled that Harrow sometimes disappeared for entire days and nobody knew where he went. That statement could not be used as direct evidence, but it supported the theory that Harrow could move freely without being recorded. Personnel notes also described Harrow as introverted, occasionally gruff, preferring to work alone, and frequently changing residences without explanation. There was no record of prior crimes, but some co-workers called him unpredictable and quick to anger over small things. Those traits alone did not suggest violent tendencies, yet combined with the geological route and vehicle evidence, the overall portrait grew increasingly suspicious. Cross-referencing every factor, employment at Garrison Dam, regular runs to Dickinson, ownership of a green pickup, residences near Minot, and an unexplained absence the night Lucy was killed, the investigation team realized Harrow matched the perpetrator profile to a remarkable degree. But to take the next step, they needed more than demographic data. They needed a direct DNA link between him and the hair found in Lucy's clothing in night. The behavioral, locational, and vehicular evidence was now falling into place, like perfectly fitted pieces of a dark puzzle. While a final conclusion was not yet possible, Harrow had emerged not merely as the strongest suspect, but as the only individual who aligned with the entire timeline and physical evidence surrounding Lucy May Halverson's death. The demographic data and work history of William Bill Harrow were already enough to elevate him to the most prominent suspect, but the investigation team knew that alone wasn't sufficient to justify the next major step, exhuming and obtaining DNA from Harrow's remains. To reach the legal threshold of probable cause, they needed to build a comprehensive, irrefutable picture of his presence, activities, and behavior during the period when Lucy disappeared. For that reason, the team launched the most extensive document search of the entire investigation, gathering every historical record that had ever captured a trace of Harrow. Requests were sent to the Ward County Archives, the North Dakota State Tax Office, the Minot City Resident Registration Office, and the repositories related to the Garrison Dam project. From hundreds of yellowed pages, they hunted for every tiny clue: where Harrow lived, when he moved, what jobs he held, who he interacted with, and most critically, where he was in the days before and after October 12, 1953, the day Lucy vanished and was murdered. Tax records revealed Harrow was anything but stable. Some years he reported full income, other years he filed nothing at all, which matched the co-worker's old description of a man who often disappeared from job. Residential records showed he had changed addresses at least 4 times in 3 years, an unusually high frequency for a local laborer. 2 of those moves happened very close to the time of the crime, immediately drawing the team's attention. They didn't stop at housing and employment records. The team expanded the search to seemingly minor but unexpectedly valuable data: vehicle repair history. Thanks to archived files from an old garage near the road to Garrison, they located repair records for a green Ford F1 pickup serviced in late night. The work order didn't list the owner by full name, but the initials and the chassis number confirmed it was the same truck registered to Harrow. What caught everyone's attention was the mechanic's note: cleaned undercarriage, multiple layers of hardened dirt, different colors, appears to be from 2 separate areas. That detail stopped the entire team in their tracks. It matched perfectly with the 1953 forensic findings of 2 distinct soil types on Lucy's clothing: red clay from the Garrison Dam area, and bentonite from Dickinson. What had once been noted only by the naked eye of the original crime scene technician now had corroboration from the suspect's own vehicle. While one forensic subgroup pored over vehicle documents, another focused on finding living witnesses, people who had known Harrow or lived near him. They interviewed dozens of elderly residents around Minot, who vaguely remembered a quiet, tall, thin man who often drove a green pickup through the old neighborhood. One woman who had lived near the boarding house Harrow rented in 1953 said she sometimes saw him coming home very late, clothes covered in mud like he'd just come back from a construction site or deep in the woods. A former Garrison Dam compressor operator recalled that Harrow had been absent exactly one night around October, but no one had recorded it because labor oversight was lax back then. Although these statements weren't accusatory on their own, they formed a suspicious chain that aligned perfectly with the route the team had reconstructed. Harrow worked at Garrison, regularly passed through Dickinson, lived near Minot, and owned a truck matching witness description. These independent pieces were gradually forming a unified picture, the portrait of a man whose opportunities, travel habits, and living circumstances fit the offender profile exactly. To solidify their findings, the team built a detailed timeline. Immediately after the crime, trucks serviced with 2 different types of soil stuck to the undercarriage. Shortly afterward, Harrow moved just weeks after Lucy's death. When this timeline was cross-referenced with the genetic profile and witness statements, the team realized the degree of overlap between Harrow and the perpetrator had far exceeded ordinary coincidence. It had entered the realm of systematic evidence, multiple independent data sources all pointing to the same name. All of these analyses were compiled into a several hundred-page report submitted to the state prosecutor's office. The report's conclusion was unequivocal. Based on the convergence of demographic records, vehicle records, soil evidence, travel routes, and behavioral patterns, William Harrow meets the criteria for an exhumation order to obtain comparative. A momentous decision was about to be made, one that no one had thought possible for the past. Once the investigative report was submitted to the state prosecutor's office and reviewed by an independent legal team, the convergence of historical records, genealogy, and physical evidence formed a rock-solid foundation for the most critical step: petitioning the court for an order to exhume the remains of William Bill Harrow. This was not merely a criminal procedure. It was also a sensitive matter involving the privacy and surviving family of a man who had died in. Nevertheless, faced with a compelling combination of genealogical evidence and indirect physical proof, the Ward County judge approved the exhumation. The moment the team had been waiting for nearly a year. The exhumation took place on an early autumn morning, while a thin layer of mist still clung to the grass at Minot Riverside Cemetery. Harrow's grave was cordoned off with wide forensic tape, and forensic personnel, technicians and representatives from the prosecutor's office were on site to oversee the process. This was not an ordinary dig. It had to follow modern forensic protocol to ensure no contamination of the samples. As the first shovelful of earth was lifted, the atmosphere grew unnaturally quiet. The forensic team meticulously documented every stage, verified the coffin's position, photographed the scene, and ensured every action was recorded for the chain of custody. When the old, slightly rotted wooden coffin was gently raised to the surface, they moved to the next phase, opening the lid and accessing the remains. Harrow's remains had naturally decomposed over time, but several long bones, particularly the femurs and humeri, were still intact enough for DNA extraction. Sampling was performed with brand-new sterile tools. Each bone fragment was placed into airtight evidence bags and labeled according to the coding system. For integrity, every bag was sealed on site and signed off by 3 parties: forensics, prosecution, and Minot police. The bone samples were then transported in a refrigerated container to the state crime lab, where experts had already prepared protocols specifically for decades-old remains. Unlike the hair sample from Lucy's case, DNA from bone, if sufficiently preserved, would yield a complete genetic profile. The first step was surface cleaning to remove soil, mold, and other contaminant. The bones were then fed into a specialized grinder to produce fine bone powder from which DNA could be extracted. Because Harrow had been dead for over 3 decades, the team used the latest generation bone DNA extraction method capable of recovering genetic material even at minimal level. The process took many days. Every step was cross-checked by 2 independent technicians to eliminate errors. Finally, the initial results appeared on the analysis screen. A viable DNA profile had been obtained from the bone. This allowed the team to proceed to the crucial next stage: direct comparison of Harrow's DNA with the DNA from the hair found on Lucy's clothing and night. The lab ran both profiles in parallel, focusing on the short tandem repeat STR markers used in modern forensic standards. Each genetic locus was compared, numbered, coded, and matched. For accuracy, the same samples were run on 2 different machines, and both produced identical results. A few hours after analysis was complete, the lead forensic scientist gathered everyone involved in the technical meeting room. The results table was unmistakable. The DNA profile from Harrow's bone matched 100% with the DNA extracted from the hair on Lucy's jacket. Not 50%, not 70%, not partial compatibility, a full, complete match, proving Harrow was the person who left that hair at the crime scene. Before the report was officially released, however, the forensic experts conducted an additional independent round of testing to rule out any possibility of contamination. A comparison with mitochondrial DNA (mtDNA) from the hair also corresponded to the maternal lineage of the Harrow family, further reinforcing the conclusion's reliability. Once all verification was finished, the forensic team drafted the official 60-plus page report, detailing the sample sources, analytical methods, degree of genetic match, and final scientific conclusion. The report was then forwarded to the prosecutor's office, along with supporting evidence of Harrow's residence history, travel patterns, occupation, and vehicle ownership. The DNA match was not just a case-breaker, it was a historic milestone for the Lucy May Halverson investigation. For the first time in 66 years, the identity of the prime suspect had been scientifically confirmed, paving the way for the next legal and investigative step. The final forensic conclusion from the North Dakota State Lab was returned to the investigation team just 1 day after the last round of verification, and when the sealed envelope was opened, everyone understood this was the defining moment of a journey spanning more than 6 decades. The very first line of the forensic report left no room for doubt. The bone DNA of William Bill Harrow was a complete match with the DNA from the hair found on Lucy May Halverson's jacket. The team did not rush to announce the finding. Instead, they began the process of integrating every piece of evidence collected since the case was reopened. The analysis unit combined every element: geology, vehicle, travel routes, residence history, demographics, genealogy, and cross-referenced them all against the newly confirmed DNA result. The perpetrator's image was no longer a hypothetical sketch. It was now a complete model built on independent data points that aligned perfectly when assembled. First, the soil. 2 distinct types, Dickinson bentonite and Garrison dam red clay, found on Lucy's clothes. In 1953, Harrow was one of the very few individuals whose work route took him through both locations at the exact same time. His job hauling materials made it natural for soil to end up on his shoes, clothing, or truck undercarriage. Next, the vehicle, a dark green early 1950s Ford F1 pickup, matching the rare description given by witness Alice Morgan, the only child who saw a truck lingering in the parking lot near Sunset Laundromat. The post-crime repair record further strengthened suspicion when the mechanic noted Harrow's undercarriage was caked with different-colored dirt that had to be scraped off multiple times. The convergence of geological material and vehicle created a direct link from the crime scene to Harrow's action. Then came travel patterns and demographics. Harrow lived only a few miles from where Lucy disappeared and had an unexplained absence from Garrison Dam during the exact week of the crime. No other suspect on the genealogy list had a timeline that matched so precisely. His sudden moves after 1953 also fit the pattern of fleeing or changing environments after committing a crime, especially crimes against children. Yet all of the above served only as strong supporting evidence. The decisive factor was the DNA, science that cannot be bent or refuted. The hair and bone profiles matched across the entire standard STR framework. The probability of match was so high that the chance of error was effectively zero. As a final safeguard, the lab also ran mitochondrial DNA comparison, and it aligned with the Harrow maternal line, removing any lingering doubt about the hair's owner. With all data integrated, the team classified the evidence by legal weight. Level 1 direct scientific evidence, complete DNA match. The strongest form of proof in modern U.S. criminal law. Level 2 strong circumstantial evidence. Soil from 2 areas where Harrow worked, repair records, 1953 residence and travel history. Level 3 witness evidence. Alice Morgan's description of the green pickup, scattered recollections of a tall, thin man frequently seen in the area. Level 4 genealogical data. Harrow positioned as the central suspect across the entire family tree built from distant GED match relatives. When layered together, these tiers of evidence did not merely point to Harrow as a suspect, they eliminated every other possibility. No other individual in the family tree, residence records or geological travel patterns came anywhere close. The case was no longer about who might have done it. It had become the only person who fits every single criteria. Finally, the investigation team drafted the concluding report, the document that would become the historical foundation of the entire case. It did not merely declare Harrow the perpetrator. It reconstructed the full 66-year investigative journey, from the night Lucy walked into the darkness in 1953, through the faint traces nearly erased by time, to the moment modern science dragged the killer into the light. The identity of the man who took Lucy May Halverson's life, for decades the greatest mystery in the city of Minot, was now confirmed, beyond any dispute. William Bill Harrow was the sole perpetrator. After the DNA conclusion identified William Bill Harrow as the sole perpetrator, the next step for the investigative team was to compile a comprehensive forensic report, a document that connected every piece of the puzzle across more than 6 decades, clearly demonstrating why the Lucy May Halverson case could finally be closed on solid scientific ground. This report served both as a legal instrument and as a complete synthesis of the entire investigation, from the rudimentary methods of 1953 to the advanced genetic techniques of the opening section of the report presented a complete investigative timeline, beginning on the evening of October 12, when Lucy left home to do laundry and vanished on a stretch of road only a few hundred meters long between her residence and the Sunset Laundromat. The timeline detailed every milestone: the discovery of the box of laundry detergent, the search for drag marks, witness Alice Morgan, the woods along the riverbank, Lucy's body, tire tracks and clay smear. It then covered the 1953-1954 investigation phase, suspects who were cleared, dead ends, the lack of forensic tools, and the impasse that ultimately relegated the case to cold case status. The timeline also clearly showed the reopening of the case in 2019, DNA analysis of the hair fibers, the construction of the suspect's family tree, and finally the exhumation of Harrow for DNA comparison. Immediately following the timeline was the forensic summary, a visual comparison between the severe limitations of 1953 forensics and the near miraculous capabilities of modern forensics. The report described how in 1953, police could only rely on items like hair fibers were retained only due to individual diligence, not because they held recognized evidentiary value. Yet that very preservation, an act that seemed meaningless at the time, became the linchpin of modern forensics. The core argumentative section of the report laid out the logic for charging Harrow through 3 layers of evidence. Direct scientific evidence. DNA from the crime scene hair matched the DNA from Harrow's exhumed bones with absolute certainty. This was the indisputable foundation. Corroborative circumstantial evidence. The clay trail, his residence, his work route through Garrison Dam Dickinson. Repair records showing heavy clay from multiple regions. Behavioral and demographic evidence. Harrow was present near the crime scene during the window of the offense, absent from his time clock station, owned a 1951 green pickup, matching the witness description. When combined, these 3 layers formed a tight logical structure that fully satisfied modern criminal legal standards. 1 suspect, 1 chain of behavior, 1 complete DNA match. The report also devoted a special section to explaining why the original investigation failed. It was not due to lack of effort, but the constraints of the era. No DNA technology, no national databases, no precise geological analysis tools. Tire and shoe prints were hard to match, and labor and vehicle management at the time was lax. Moreover, Harrow had no prior record, limited community interaction, and left no fingerprints or obvious physical evidence, allowing him to slip completely through the 1950s. At the end of the report, the prosecutor's office and the forensic team confirmed that the case met every legal standard for closure. The perpetrator was identified by DNA, no alternative suspects remained, no contradictory evidence existed, and the statute of limitations had long expired. The report also affirmed that although Harrow had been dead for decades, identifying the killer carried historic justice, answering a question the entire city of Minot had waited over 6 decades to hear. With this comprehensive forensic report, the Lucy May Halverson case officially moved into its final conclusion phase, the turning point before public disclosure and the profound aftershock it would leave in the community. With the comprehensive forensic report confirmed and signed off by the prosecutor's office, the final step in a journey spanning 7 decades was the public announcement of the solved case to the entire state of North Dakota. That morning, at the North Dakota Attorney General's headquarters in Bismarck, a large-scale press conference was held, drawing reporters from across the upper Midwest. Though the crime occurred in 1953, its historical weight and symbolic significance made the event the focal point of local media. From the very start of the press conference, the Attorney General stated that this was one of the oldest cold cases ever solved in the state and a powerful testament to the combined strength of modern forensics, public genealogy data, and traditional evidence preservation. Every document, from the DNA report and family tree reconstruction to historical vehicle analysis, had been verified multiple times before release. Following the opening remarks, the Forensic Division presented a scientific summary. The DNA from the crime scene hair and Harrow's bone sample matched completely, with near absolute certainty. Genetic markers were displayed clearly and transparently, along with a description of the independent parallel analysis process. Genealogy experts then explained how the family tree was built from distant matches on GED match, gradually narrowing down to the Harrow lineage through hundreds of hours, analyzing civil records, church documents, and old census data. The next part of the announcement emphasized that no other suspect fit the full chain of evidence. The Attorney General presented a comparison table of key factors: age, residence, work route, ability to be in Minot at the time of the crime, vehicle matching the witness description, geologically unique clay traces, and finally, the DNA conclusion. The combination of these data points formed a complete suspect profile with no reasonable alternative. During the media Q&A, investigators confirmed the case had been recorded as a solved cold case in North Dakota's registry and would be entered into the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NamUs, and the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICOP, for National Forensic Archive. This not only marked the closure of a mystery spanning nearly 70 years, but also added valuable data for future forensic research. In parallel, the investigative team released a detailed report to forensic agencies nationwide, clearly analyzing handling procedures for decades-old evidence, DNA extraction technology from aged hair, the integration of genealogy and behavioral analysis, and the hybrid investigative model combining traditional and modern forensics. The report is expected to become a reference document for units wishing to reopen cases from the pre-DNA era. At the close of the press conference, the Attorney General's representative delivered a clear conclusion: the Lucy May Halverson case is officially closed under current legal standards. The perpetrator has been identified through direct scientific evidence, and no reasonable basis remains for any alternative theory. There would be no prosecution, as Harrow died in the... But justice, however delayed, had been served through the establishment of truth and the final answer given to the victim's family and the Minot community. The announcement of the solved case was not merely the end of a criminal file, it was a milestone for North Dakota investigations. Proof that no matter how much time passes, the truth can still be recovered when science and human determination walk hand in hand. News that the killer had been identified after nearly 70 years spread through Minot within hours of the Attorney General's announcement, and the community's reaction went far beyond mere surprise. It was a deep wave of emotion, blending relief, sadness, regret, and an indescribable shock. For many older residents, the name William Bill Harrow came as a jolt. They had known him as a quiet, withdrawn man, who never gave the impression of being dangerous. Families who lived in Minot in 1953 began sharing memories they had kept locked away for decades. Some vaguely recalled seeing a green pickup parked near the laundry area that year. Others remembered a man who often walked through the neighborhood late at night, but no one paid much attention because everyone back then was busy with post-war life. Those small, seemingly trivial memories suddenly became pieces of history, sending chills down many spines at how thin the line can sometimes be between ordinary person and killer. Many elderly residents admitted feeling regret for the 1953 investigators, believing the police at the time had done everything they could. Learning that the perpetrator lived right in the area, interacted with the community, and repeatedly escaped notice prompted questions about the limits of old-school policing. An era without modern forensics, DNA databases, centralized population records, or tools to analyze microscopic traces like a single hair. At the same time, universities and forensic training centers in the state saw renewed interest from students and the public in modern forensic science. People began closely following how DNA, genetic genealogy, and long-term evidence preservation can dramatically alter a case's fate. Numerous articles and reports delved into how the investigative field has evolved, from relying on unreliable witnesses to being able to identify a killer from a 66-year-old strand of hair. Minot also faced an unavoidable reality. The Lucy case forced the community to re-examine its belief in small-town safety. For decades, Minot had been seen as safer than most of America, but the fact that a serious offender lived among them unnoticed shifted that perception. Not to sow fear, but to remind everyone that community safety must be maintained through technology, vigilance, and effective investigation. On a broader level, the Lucy May Halverson case quickly became a historical lesson for North Dakota. State investigative agencies used it as a prime example of the value of long-term evidence preservation, persistence with cold cases, and the importance of combining traditional forensics with modern genetic genealogy. Officials stressed that had any 1953 evidence been lost, destroyed, or misjudged, today's conclusion might never have been reached. For Minot, the case did not simply close a painful chapter, it etched a new awareness. Justice may arrive late, but with science and perseverance, it can still find its way back, even after 7 decades that seemed forgotten. Although the Lucy May Halverson case took place in 1953, the nearly 70-year journey to solve it clearly reflects issues American society still faces today, from community safety and investigative capability to the role of science and civic responsibility in protecting children. The fact that Lucy was walking just a few hundred meters from home to the laundromat, a short distance any modern American parent has let their child walk, reminds us that even the most familiar settings can harbor danger. The reality that Harrow lived in the area, interacted normally, and had no prior record shows that risk doesn't always come from the dangerous stranger, but sometimes from the most ordinary-seeming people in our midst. This is especially relevant in today's America, where child abductions or assaults in residential areas still occur despite vastly improved security systems. The initial failure of the case, due to lack of technology, also serves as a reminder that modern forensic science is not just a support tool, it is the backbone of justice. A tiny hair preserved from 1953, once thought useless, became the link that cracked the case. This carries a practical lesson: preserving data, documents, and evidence in everyday life matters just as much. In the digital age, that can mean saving emails, photos, transaction records, or anything that might help reconstruct the truth when needed. Finally, the 7-decade journey to identify the killer demonstrates the value of perseverance and community cooperation. Elderly witnesses recalling events, tax records, repair logs, genealogy data, all of it only gained meaning when each person chose to contribute their piece of information. In today's America, where sharing information is sometimes downplayed due to privacy concerns, Lucy's story reminds us that justice only arrives when a community collectively preserves memory, respects truth, and never forgets cases that seem too long ago. Thank you for following this nearly 70-year case resolution. If you found it meaningful, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next cold case files. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring mysteries unlocked through perseverance and the power of science.